Sometimes we think we have a monopoly today on information about living things, but as early as 1 Kings 4, we know that King Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived on earth, was already thinking about animals and birds and reptiles and fish and even plant life on earth. And from what we know about it, if he were actually the smartest and wisest man on earth, he must have known quite a bit about these things. So let's go back a little bit and think about what we did in labs earlier this year. When you either used a worm or a brine shrimp in the experiment that you did you stop to think that these were actually in a totally different environment than what they would have been in nature somewhere? A brine shrimp would have been in a salty ocean swimming around. An earthworm would have been in some soil environment in a temperate zone at some place on Earth. And this is where we get into this area. We can't compartmentalize science and just think about one particular part of the way life works. We can't just talk about the physiology or the chemistry or the climatology or something like that. We started realizing a few years ago that you kind of have to consider things in a context. And the context of life on Earth considers everything about where this animal was or is or has existed or has its behavior located in. Let's back up for a little bit and think about this. A paradigm is a big way of thinking about something, a cultural way of considering big ideas. And we've had several paradigm shifts in recorded history that we know about. And this is a change in the way that society actually thinks about the way things really are, or reality as we would call it. I can remember one, and you probably don't remember this, but there was a huge cultural change when 9/11 happened. You may have heard your parents talk about this, but before 9/11, for example, we were actually as a society kind of innocent in the way that we thought about terrorism and dangers. You hear people say we had unlocked doors. People didn't have to lock their doors at night because they weren't afraid of things. There's some truth in that, but 9/11 actually made us a little bit on edge about what terrorists could do to the nation. And after that, things really did change, and I wish you could have experienced some of these changes. For example, I could have gone on, and I actually did, walk my friend up to the door of an airplane and actually took them up the ramp on the tarmac to their plane and into their seat, and I sat with them for a while and talked to them while everyone else was getting on the plane. And after a while, the stewardess said, well, it's time for everyone to get off if you're not leaving with the plane. So I got off and walked back into the airport, and think about how different that is now. We have a totally different idea about how safety works and about how security and dangers to society work. And our whole nation now is different in the way that we think about things like this. And think about this. Back when we considered the idea that the earth might have been the center of the universe, people actually thought and taught that the earth was the center, and it was the kind of the standard by which we measured everything else in the universe. And then along comes Copernicus, who says, I think the earth may not be the center of the universe. And of course, the people at that time, and especially the church at that time, had the erroneous idea that earth was the center, because obviously God would put the center of the universe as where man was located. And we now know that's just not true. It doesn't diminish man's standing as the image bearers of God, but at the same time, we now know that no, earth is just one tiny little rock in the whole vast universe that's out there. And definitely the universe doesn't revolve around the earth, even if God does consider us important in some way as image bearers. And then, of course, Jesus was a huge paradigm shifter. When he taught, he actually emphasized the fact that people were important. And it wasn't just the idea that a society or a nation was important, but he brought to the forefront a strange idea that actually it sounds normal to us today because we consider people to be the center of whatever we're talking about. But at that time, Jesus was preaching something that was totally new to people, and that was the idea that people were important individually in some way, and that his lost sheep were individually important to him. And he also had ideas such as women were important and children were important, and it wasn't just a patriarchal system that we lived in anymore. And as you know, we had a big paradigm shift when we finally figured out that we weren't the only living species in the universe. So when we finally met the Vulcans on Star Trek, yes, Star Trek, we finally figured out that no, we're not the center of the universe. So imagine this. What if you were in an isolated place somewhere in, I don't know, Alberta, Canada, and a big snowstorm hits, and there you are in your little cabin just sitting there, all safe and sound, completely isolated from everything else. That's the way we typically thought of life on Earth when we had the old paradigm of thinking about life, because typically we would just consider the idea that if you think about a living species, let's just take it back to the lab and dissect it and look at it, and we don't really have to understand where it came from or anything like that. And we now know that that's not the way the Earth works. In fact, I can remember zoos back in the 1960s where you would go to one cage and it would be a barred cage with an elephant standing in it, and a bucket of water and a concrete floor. And then you go to the next cage, exactly the same thing with a tiger in it. And then the next cage would have a gorilla or something like that. And that's just the way we thought about things back then. We considered living things to be just individual units of life walking around just all completely isolated from their environment. We now know that that's not really the way that life on Earth works. And so we had a paradigm shift that said it's not really just the individual animal or species we're talking about. It's the species in the context of the nature that's surrounding it. So everything on Earth, as the Bible clearly says, has a proper place that it lives in. And God designed it to live in a particular place, not just an isolated animal that can sit in a lab somewhere by itself. This is a picture of the Chinese exhibit that goes around occasionally, and it shows basically cadavers that have been plasticized, and it was meant to show the musculature and different things about the way humans work. So for example, if you just looked at this picture here and tried to determine what human life was like looking at this, you would assume that, yeah, humans have muscles and they can carry a basketball or something. But that just gives you a small picture of the way humans really are. You can't just look at an isolated one event right here, totally separated from other people and environments and things like that, and get a true picture of what life on Earth really is like. And that's why in the 60s, we get this brand new idea that comes up that when you think about a living thing, you can't just consider it in an isolated, sterile lab somewhere. You have to think this animal or this plant actually lived in a place that had all kinds of other factors. So it may have had water, it may have had different atmosphere, different temperatures, and that was really a big paradigm shift. So if you think about major paradigm shifts that have happened, this is one of the biggest ones that ever happened in biology. The idea that you literally have living things that are in the context of something that's a real living environment with all kinds of factors and not just necessarily whatever that living thing looks like. And we started calling that ecology. I can actually remember this, so I'm old enough to remember probably the early to mid 60s when this word came on the scene. And I actually remember hearing this word for the first time and thinking, what is this thing they're talking about here? And it literally means, it's based on the Greek word oikos, where you get the word eco from. And of course, logy just means the study of, but it's the study of an oikos. Oikos literally means house in Greek. And so what we're doing, we're considering that things literally live in a house or an environment. They're not just something separated from where they live or other things that are surround them in some way. And that's very true. God created a universe and especially an ecosystem here on earth where things are interrelated to each other. They're tied to each other in some way. And of course, you people have been brought up in that idea. It was totally foreign to what I was thinking at the time. But like I said, you probably were brought up in the idea from watching the Disney Channel and other things like that, that we are interconnected in the way that we live in our environment. But that's called ecology. And like I said, literally it means the study of the house that we live in. This probably started from a lady called Rachel Carson, who in the 1960s started noticing that something was wrong in the environment. And to make a long story short, a friend of hers wrote her a letter that talked about the idea that the birds in a particular island that they used to visit didn't seem to be there anymore. And so the friend said, this bird island that we used to go to is now kind of silent because there are no birds there. And when Rachel started looking into this, she found out that what had happened was the island was sprayed with DDT, which was an insecticide, and the purpose was at that time to get rid of mosquitoes in the area. What happened, though, was at some point, this poison also affected the population of birds. And so for the first time ever that they remembered, there were no birds singing, and that's hence the name Silent Spring here. But that started Rachel Carson thinking about a broader idea that we were, in the 60s, we were under the impression that we could do anything to the environment and it wouldn't really affect much of anything else. And that was a fallacy at that time. There wasn't anything biblical about that because the biblical idea is that we were placed in a garden at some point. We weren't just isolated people living on an empty matrix somewhere. We were in a garden that had trees and soil and temperature and things like that. And so Rachel Carson was getting back to that idea that said we've kind of drifted away from that, and we think that we can do anything on planet Earth to affect the Earth, and it will have no effect on us as people. And so to make a long story short, she went through many processes and many books talking about this idea that, no, if you change a part of the environment, if you kill one part of the environment, even if it's a mosquito or a tick or something we don't like, that will definitely have an effect on the entire environment, because you can't just isolate an organism or an animal into one single little area and say, I can do something with this that will have no effect on anything else. So let's consider this. This is Deep Space Nine, if you watch one episode of Star Trek. This is a kind of a port in space. It's a very large area that ships going into the D quadrant can dock themselves and replenish their supplies and everything. So basically, let's consider this. What if you were on a spaceship, and this has actually been proposed by NASA. What if we could send a ship far away to a galaxy that's several light years away, and let's say it would take 400 years to get there? What would you need on a ship to send a group of people on a 400-year trip? Because obviously, you're going to have several generations born in 400 years. So what would you need on that ship to make sure that those people had everything they needed for a 400-year journey? Or let's make it even simpler. What if, let's say sometime when you're in college, you get the notice like we did with the pandemic that says, okay, everyone has to barricade themselves in their room and you can't come out for any reason for 6 weeks. Okay, so what if you had, let's say, 48 hours to prepare for that? What would you actually do? So think about that. What would you and let's say a roommate in college do if you were in an apartment together and all of a sudden you had this mandate that said, we're going to close up everything. You have to tape up your doors and stay in your room completely for the next 6 weeks, we'll say. What kind of things would you want with you to make sure you survived? I'm thinking you definitely would want water. So let's say a typical water bottle. How many water bottles would it take you to survive for one day? I'm thinking most people, if you're a healthy person, one bottle of water may be a minimum. You may need 2 or 3. So let's think about that. Over a 6-week period, how many bottles of water would that take? So that would be a big pile of water when you think about it. And that would be if you totally supplied every drop of water that you needed for that 6 weeks right there without recycling or anything. Okay, how much food would you need for 6 weeks? And what type of food would that be? Would you go and gather 400 boxes of mac and cheese or something like that? So really think about it. How much food and what would it look like if you stored every single bit of food that you would need for 6 weeks? Now let's think about other things. You've got food and water, but what about electricity? Have you made allowances for that? Or if that really happened, would the electric plant workers be barricaded in a room somewhere? So maybe you wouldn't even have electricity. You may have to have something that would suffice for that. So if you wanted to have, let's say, just a music player of some sort, would you need some kind of battery that would last for 6 weeks? What would that take? And what kind of medications would you need? Would you need Tylenol for pain? Do you take a medication now that you would need to stockpile for 6 weeks? Oh, and let's think about this. If you taped up your doors and windows, would you be able to have oxygen that was outside coming in? So what if you had to supply all the oxygen that you needed to survive for 6 weeks? And so this obviously is kind of creative thinking, but when you think about it, think of the piles of stuff that you literally would have to survive for any period of time. And would it be possible to store up that much in a single, let's say a college dorm for 6 weeks at a time? And that was part of Rachel Carson's idea here. If we live on a planet where things are already limited, and if you think about the idea that we have to store up certain amounts of stuff, that really doesn't correspond to how it works on Earth, because in most cases, we or nature recycles things that we need. Or someone grows the food for us, or in the case of oxygen, it would recycle too, because a plant would take in our CO2 and give off oxygen. But Rachel Carson's idea was the Earth is sort of like a spaceship, because whatever is on the Earth right now is literally all we have to work with, and we can't go somewhere else outside of Earth to bring in oxygen or water or food or something. So when you think about it, Earth is like this huge spaceship, and I've heard people say that. There was a term back in the 60s talking about spaceship Earth, trying to make us realize that, yeah, you better take care of what's here, because what's here right now is literally all that will ever be here. We don't get things coming in from outer space, or we can't order things from Mars to bring into Earth. We have what we have, whether it's minerals, metals, food, oxygen, or whatever, water, it's here right now. And Rachel Carson's point was, if you don't take care of what's here, then, or especially if you don't recycle what's here and keep reusing it, or at least allow for that process, then we're in big trouble. And that idea kind of caught on, and people started thinking, we're not just an animal in a cage, we're in an ecosystem, or a system that somehow recycles things, and it has to be that way, otherwise we're not going to survive. Back in the 70s, somebody started to, or tried to, kind of illustrate Rachel Carson's idea here. And I think this was in Canada, where they built this huge dome that covered about 2 acres of land. And they were trying to show Rachel Carson's idea. So the idea was they put 3 people in this dome, and they put in all the stuff they needed to survive inside the dome. So the rule was for 5 years, nothing could go in except what? Yeah, sunlight shining through the dome here. So that's kind of what Earth is like. We get light coming in from the sun, but we don't get anything else coming in from any other planet or space or anything else. We are essentially in a dome like this on planet Earth. And these people tried to prove that just by showing, yeah, we can recycle the oxygen, we'll grow plants that will take in our CO2 and give off oxygen. We can eat the plants. We can have our waste material turned back to fertilizer to fertilize the plants. And that illustrates what the Earth is doing right now. Just a side note, that didn't work too well because I think it was 2 men and 1 woman that tried this, and they had a little love triangle going on that didn't work out too well. So one of the guys killed the other guy, and yeah, it was just a sad story to start with. And so more recently, we've tried this. I think this one is in Arizona or New Mexico somewhere, but they do have an operating system here. This thing that you see here is a totally enclosed ecosystem that shows that everything in there can be recycled and repurposed without having anything come in except the sunlight that's shining on these panels here. And I think it's working pretty well so far. This is the entry place that the public can go just as a kind of a PR thing. So you can go in and see that you're totally enclosed in this area. Yeah, here's the happy people going in several years ago. So a group of people that I think they were going to live there at least 5 years just to prove that, yeah, you can have an ecosystem that recycles. So let's think about that. Is Earth really almost like we could say it's in a fishbowl, because nothing can come into the fishbowl except nothing can come in, and what's already in it is the only thing that we ever will have in the fishbowl, except for sunlight coming in. So that's the key to this. An ecosystem has to have exterior energy coming in, but whatever is there will stay there forever and essentially be there, and that's all there is. So if we're going to continue as a species and as living things, we have to have these things obviously recycled, because there's a limited amount of water, limited amount of oxygen, and those things have to be replenished in some way. And again, that was Rachel Carson's point, that we can't mess up one part of this, because we could be messing up the recycling or the replenishing of one of these parameters that we see. So yeah, that's kind of the basis of what we consider ecology. The idea that on planet Earth, God has a system that things recycle themselves. In fact, we know that. We are dirt people. We are made of dirt, and we will go back to dirt someday. Our waste material recycles back into nitrates that eventually will go into plants. The plants grow. We eat the plants. Animals eat the plants. We eat the animals. But eventually, it's just big circles of things going around. As the movie says, it's the circle of life that just goes around and around. And for the time being, that's the way God has planned planet Earth. We have things that must be recycled, because those are things that we have to have as resources. And so you can imagine ways we might possibly mess this up. And obviously there are problems any way you look at it. And, you know, what alternatives do we have? Right now, the things that we use that we don't use anymore, we typically take them to a landfill, and most landfills will bulldoze them down and cover them with dirt, and you just keep building on top of this, and you end up with huge mountains of waste material that are just there underground and not usable anymore. So some people see that as a problem with ecology and environmental areas, because you have all of this stuff you see here, which looking at, I'm seeing mostly, it looks like cardboard, paper, plastic, things like that, which could easily be recycled back into other stuff. And so the problem some people see is that we're burying all of this stuff and actually taking it out of the recycling idea that we have. and that obviously is not good. And I think in all of the political controversies in all of this, we kind of have to keep that in mind, that we do waste a lot of things, and we do put things in places that they can't be recycled. So we have to agree with Rachel Carson, at least on that we probably could do better about taking care of some of these ideas. What about human bodies? This is just a weird thing to think about, but and I don't necessarily say that this is something we need to change, because obviously it's a drop in the bucket, and we need to respect people as they die. But when you think about it, even as people, we put ourselves in a coffin or a vault of some sort, and we seal ourselves up so that we can't get back into the environment anymore. And I just add that as something to think about. And like I said, I don't think it's anything we should do anything about, but it's kind of symbolic of the idea of what we have, is that we can isolate ourselves from the environment and just be there protected, and none of our elements will ever get back into the environment again. I tend to think I might like this someday. This is a biodegradable bag that when I'm buried, I think I can put myself in this. And I think it's made of hemp or cotton or something, so that when they bury me, not only will my body go back to the dust, but the bag that I'm processed in will go back. Just a thought. I'm ordering one on Amazon just to make sure. And actually, I think I'll do this too. This is Craig's Landscaping from Oklahoma, and I may have to move this to Arkansas now, but they agreed for $200 to bury my bag and plant a tree on top of it. So I'm still considering that. I may have it someday, maybe not. I actually sent them a diagram of what I wanted, and they said, yeah, we can do that for you. And I've chosen a ginkgo tree because I just like ginkgos. And so the ginkgo will grow into my body and soak up my nitrates. And someday my grandkids or great-grandkids can come and carve their initial on the tree and say, yeah, there's a piece of great-granddad growing in that tree. Maybe not. But back again, look at planet Earth. Like we said, we are a closed ecosystem. The only thing coming into planet Earth literally is sunlight. We don't have a lot of stuff like nutrients coming into the earth. We have a few satellites that we launch, but those are obviously negligible in the amount of stuff that we put into space at any one time. But yeah, we need to think about this, that Earth is a total ball of all the resources we ever will have. So when God created the earth, nothing would be added to it, nothing taken away from it significantly, and we had better take care of it. In fact, that's what he told Adam, to be a steward of the earth, and steward literally means a caretaker. We need to take care of earth. And apart from any political extremism or whatever we hear, that is true. We have one planet that we live on, and what we have on that planet is all that we'll ever have to deal with. So it makes sense that if for nothing else, at least for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, we need to take care of what's here. Okay, so for this unit, we've got two directions we could go. In today's society, we have the kind of politicized philosophical view, and I tend to call that environmentalism, as opposed to just the purely scientific view of the environment, which I'll call ecology. Now let's think about that. We can concentrate on either of these. So for the next few minutes or units or whatever, let's go to the bottom here and just do the scientific part of this. And remember, as you're reading through your book isn't necessarily a biblical source of information. So as you read through, look at some of the ways that environmentalism may creep into our study of ecology in one way or the other. So let's define this word then. Ecology, we've already seen, it means the study of the house. Let's put a more practical definition on it. Ecology is studying how living things can relate to each other and to their surroundings. So check out this picture. What do you see? If you said deer, you're really biased, because when I looked at this, I saw those pretty flowers and the green plants behind it. So look at that chicory and those daisy plants. I'm a botanist, by the way, and so my bias is to look toward plants first rather than animals. Yeah, if you ever see me driving my truck, I probably won't wave back at you because I'm not looking at people in other cars. I'm looking at trees and plants. Sorry about that. But yeah, ecology is both of those things. You can't just have one single thing that draws your attention. So obviously the deer is very cute and picturesque, and your attention goes immediately to the large mammal. But look at all the other stuff there. You've got flowers growing, you've got grass, you've got weeds. I can even see rocks in the distance. And when you think about it, you also have the soil, you've got temperature, you've got light levels, and all of these things that we could be studying. And that's the mindset that we're talking about. Ecology is this new way of thinking about living things that doesn't just look at the most prominent living thing there. It looks at the whole system of living things. The prominent thing and all the things that it's eating, all the factors that play into what it's doing, and everything else. And that's what real ecology is. I like to think about it as a circle like this, or as a triangle. We have an organism, and then we think about how is that organism related to other organisms. So, for example, I'm a human, and I could just look at my own human body, but on my own human body, when you think about it, you may not like this, but you have a colony of mites living in your eyelashes right now. You're not just a walking human. You're kind of a walking jungle of stuff. You've got mites living in your eyelashes. You've got another population of mites living in your ear. Go ahead and scratch right now. It's okay. You have fungus growing on your skin and in your ears and in the crevices of your body. You've got bacteria. In fact, you have more bacterial cells growing on and in your body right now than you actually have cells in your body. So remember, we said you were a 100,000 or 100 trillion cells. You got about 10 times the number, or about 1,000 trillion bacterial cells and fungal cells living on your body. So you're definitely not just a single organism. You're living in a symbiosis, you could say, with other organisms. And that's not even counting the things that live in your stomach, those bacteria that help you digest food. You know, you hear about probiotics and prebiotics because you literally have a colony of living things living in your intestines that actually help you in certain ways. And then let's add to that the idea that you're not just sitting there in an empty space somewhere. You're sitting there with a temperature. In fact, most humans prefer something around the 72 degree range. And you're breathing oxygen in an atmosphere that's about 21% oxygen. You have a humidity that's affecting you right now. In the summertime, you actually notice it because the humidity, when it gets up around 90%, you start to feel it and you say, man, it's really sticky here. So all of these things put together, they go into making the whole ecology that you're living in right now. And as I keep saying, that's the idea, the new paradigm that came about. You can't just think about a single living organism. You've got to think about the organism in the context of all the other organisms that are affecting it, all the environmental factors that are affecting it, and literally everything that goes into having any effect whatsoever on that creature. We use a word here, the living parts of this triangle, the organisms and the other things, we call that the biotic factor. Bio meaning just life, and so those are the living things. And we also talk about the abiotic factors, those non-living things. So, for example, abiotic would be what we just mentioned, the temperature, the humidity, the light level, and anything like that, anything that's a parameter that would affect it in some way. Think about either your worm or your shrimp that you used and all the different abiotic factors that may have been affecting it when you were trying to do one thing to it. So you may have had light levels, temperature, and all of these other things that were nuisance variables affecting how your worm or your shrimp was acting. Okay, a few definitions here that will help later on. When we talk about a single living thing, let's just call that an organism. So that's what I have here, a snail. There's an organism, one single living life form. If I have several of that same type of life form, I call that a population. If I have two separate groups of life forms, and that's very probable in most situations, you would have a population, let's say, of one animal or several animals and different plants. So that would be considered a community. And I'll show you how that's different from something else later on. But outside right now, we probably have, I'm thinking we've got robins and we've got, bugs. We'll just say bugs in general. What else? Squirrels. We have squirrels running around both campuses here. We have a population of several types of trees out front. We have lacebark elms. We have swamp oaks and several other types of plants. We also have just many types of grasses and weeds. If you look out the back door, you'll see probably 100 different species of different plants. And so we definitely have a community. We've got two or more groups of organisms that are there somewhere. Now, I have what's called a community aquarium that I keep. And what I did was I go to the pet shop and I just pick out fish that look pretty, because that's what I like to look at. So I get a molly from the Yucatan Peninsula. I get a guppy from Trinidad. I get a sailfin from China. And I get a loach from Africa, just because I go to the pet shop and I see all these pretty fish and I say, wouldn't they look good together? And then I come home and throw them all into the same tank together. That's called a community tank. And you see why? Because I picked plants and animals from many different places on Earth that never would have met each other in any other context. So I'm thinking there's no way a guppy from Trinidad is ever going to make it to the Yucatan Peninsula to meet all the mollies that are there. And that's the purest idea of a community, things that are just totally unrelated to each other. And for the most part, in my aquarium, the little neon fish all stay to themselves, the mollies stay to themselves, the guppies stay to themselves in one little school of fish somewhere. Occasionally one will nibble at the fins of another one, but they pretty much are in a clique by themselves. So they're not interacting with each other. And that's important because a community just has the organisms there not interacting with each other. Okay, so most of the time, though, look what happens. We don't just have a community, we have what's called an ecosystem. An ecosystem is when all the organisms start interacting with each other. So what if those snails in this picture started nibbling on the plants? And what if those snails pooped out nitrates, which they will? Those nitrates now will go into the soil, and the plants will absorb the nitrates from the soil. So there's an interaction. The snails interact with the plants in a two-dimensional kind of way. And when you think about it, the snails are animals. They're giving off CO2 and taking in oxygen. The plants are taking in CO2 and giving off oxygen. I mean, what a perfect world there. So that's the perfect definition of an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a situation in which you had at least two different populations interacting with each other. They're not just a community, they are interacting with each other in some way. And that's, again, what Rachel Carson was talking about. You can't go in now if they're interacting. If you took away the plants, the snails are really going to be in trouble because they are missing a part of their contextual existence there because they don't have something that they need to keep on living in some way. Here's another way of looking at it. An organism is just one part of a population. A population or several populations would make up a community. And it's possible if in that community things started interacting with each other, which they probably will, you would have a full-fledged ecosystem to some extent. And we'll see these words applied later too. So in a real functioning ecosystem, eventually we're going to identify habitats, the biotic parameters, the abiotic, and several niches that may be filled by some of these. Now, here's a picture on top of Elk Mountain at, this is actually in the Wichita Wildlife Reserve in southwestern Oklahoma. I like to go there. It's one of my favorite places because it looks so, I guess it looks different from places that I've grown up in. So here I'm looking off toward, actually that's Texas in the far distance over there. So I'm in the very corner of Oklahoma looking southwest toward Texas. And those are the mountains of Texas I see in the distance. So let's look at what an ecosystem could be. I could talk about this one tiny little circle here, and the smallest ecosystem circle, I'm going to call that the under the rock ecosystem. Because if I turn that rock over, I bet I would find two populations. I would find roly-polies, and I would find a fungus growing. And what a neat little system, because the roly-polies are going to be eating the fungus as their food, and the fungus will actually grow on the dead roly-polies and the poop from the roly-polies. So we have a definite ecosystem. We have two populations interacting with each other in an energy type way. So they depend on each other. If one of them disappeared, the other one would have to go away because they're totally dependent on each other. Okay, look at the second largest circle there. I could talk about the east side of the rock ecosystem, because if I looked at all the rocks and kind of peaks in that area, what's different about the east side of the rock versus the west side of the rock? Yeah, there's quite a bit of difference, because on the east side, it's going to be the early morning sun shining on it, which is going to be a little bit cooler and earlier in the day. And on the west side of the rock, I have the late afternoon sun shining on it, which probably is going to be hotter and drier. So what would you expect to be different about the plant and animal life that would be there? Yeah, obviously you would have things that preferred one ecosystem over the other, because the abiotic parameters of those ecosystems are different. And the way things on Earth work, animals and plants tend to grow or flourish where their needs are met. And so you have an ecosystem that we would consider one side of the rock or the other. But the original under the rock ecosystem could be a part of that bigger ecosystem. And now look at the big circle. I could think about the entire Wichita Wildlife Reserve ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem in itself. It has elk, deer, prairie dogs, all kinds of different plants. But in that ecosystem, all of those things work together to be part of that ecosystem. And the two ecosystems that I've already talked about are part of that larger ecosystem that's there. And we could even go ridiculously farther than that and say, Earth itself is actually kind of an ecosystem. So we could talk about the Earth ecosystem as being the total plant and animal life living on planet Earth, and all of these ecosystems would be a part of that. And so remember that as we talk about it, an ecosystem could be a very small specific thing. It could be a very large general type ecosystem that works in the same way.